we need to spend some time talking about the indigenous people who were in America before the Europeans came. Because as they interacted with the Europeans, a lot of history was created, and it's hard to understand unless you understand sort of the Native American context. Now, there's a disagreement as to what Native Americans are to be called. Many of them actually prefer the term American Indian. Others are more happy with Native American. And then the majority, I think, would prefer to be called by their tribal name. But that's kind of hard for us to do when we're talking about the entire group, for there are many, many different tribes of American Indians. So, and that's probably where we should start, that American Indians were not just one nation of people who all spoke the same language and who were all related to each other. They were a diverse, a wide variety of tribes and nations, kind of like Europe was at the time. A European was not, there's no such thing really as a European. There's a German and a French and a Dutch, English, and they all had different languages, different cultures, different customs. And America, it was very much that same way with regard to the Indians. Different tribes, different languages, different cultures, different degrees of hostility. Not all Native Americans were warrior tribes. There were some very peaceful tribes. And there's very different kinds of tribes in terms of being nomadic, which means they were associated with movement, moving around with different seasons. But there were actually some tribes who were quite settled, quite what we would call civilized today, where they were permanently placed on a particular riverbank somewhere. They were, in fact, what Europeans would probably call primitive. By that, we simply mean they had an oral language only. They had no written language, no letters, not even hieroglyphs, maybe some drawings along those lines, but the idea of a written text was not something they were familiar with. Unlike the Europeans, they had no concept of a real estate or a deed, or the thought that you could own a piece of land. To the American Indians, land was much like we would consider air today. It's just there for whoever needs it, whenever you need it, and when you're not needing it, somebody else uses it. That's kind of how they saw the land. So the idea of the Europeans coming and paying for the land to the natives, that was kind of like, well, that's free money for us. How can you buy land? The land belongs to the gods, as it were. The Indians would go so far to say, we'll sell you the land, we'll sell you the moon, we'll sell you the sun. What else do you want to buy from us? But what happened once they would sell pieces of land to the Europeans, they didn't think the Europeans were really serious about that, so they would come back on the land that they sold. And into the American lexicon, we get a term called an Indian giver. An Indian giver is someone, it's an idiom for someone who you sell something to or sells something to you and then wants it back. Well, it's not necessarily that these are bad people. They just didn't have a concept of ownership of land, of real estate, the way the Europeans did. They were reputed to be a very earthy people. They didn't need to wear many clothes. They were very earthy about their sexuality. They didn't feel like sexuality had to be expressed or experienced in private. They modeled themselves very much after the animal kingdom. They considered themselves one of the animals, brothers and sisters to the animals, and as the animals behaved, they believed that was the proper way of behaving. By and large, their religion was very animistic. That is to say, they saw the sacred, the divine, in the animal kingdom. They had a great respect for their ancestors, those who had gone on. Their religion often included guidance from the ancestors, calling on the ancestors to help them with the hunt, etc. And some Indians did have myths, particularly the Aztecs, which included a story of white gods coming from the east and blessing them. And certainly when Cortez came, he took great advantage of the Aztec religion as he made himself up to be that great white god. And there were indeed some American Indians who practiced human sacrifice, not all, but some did as part of their religious interactions. Now, in terms of the Europeans, interacting with the Europeans, the Native Americans were not as far advanced technologically as the Europeans, particularly with regard to guns and writing and metals in terms of defense and clothing and things of that nature. Perhaps the technology that the Europeans were able to use against the natives with great effect was not just the gunpowder and the weaponry, but writing itself. I mean, imagine having somebody who's never understood writing before, and then having one person write something down. He takes that paper, he sends it across the field to another person some distance. That other person looks at the paper, and then he interprets to the Indian what the paper says. The Indian sees that as there's something magic on the paper. How did that paper, how did those little lines communicate an entire idea? They didn't have that concept in their world, the idea of writing. And so when we get to things like treaties, Indians aren't signing their names, they're just making a mark. And they're told, if you make your mark here, good things will happen to you. Of course, disease was interpreted by just about everybody at the time as being a curse of God or a blessing of God or something. If, as far as the Europeans were concerned, the diseases that the Indians were catching was God's work to clear out the American countryside for the purpose of the settlement of God's people, the Christians. One of the things we see early on between the Indians and the Europeans was, for the sake of peace, oftentimes there would be marriages. We see the most classic one perhaps being Pocahontas being married to Mr. Rolfe in Virginia. We see Mary Musgrove, even Sacagawea later on is married to a Frenchman. A lot of these marriages are arranged or they're initiated for the sake of peace between the natives and the European settlers. They attempt to enter into treaties, quite a few treaties, going all the way back to the Pilgrims in 1620. Early on, they start writing treaties. And the treaties seem to, on the surface, they seem to benefit the Europeans, but I'm sure the Indians were told that the treaties were to their benefit as well, and perhaps they were. It'd be interesting to try to hammer something out like that, hammer out a treaty, do a reenactment where the Indians come together with the colonists, the colonials, and try to see what would be the give and take in a lesson kind of like that. Of course, we talked about the fishermen, that these Indians were interacting with the fishermen. We saw the disintegration of the Aztec Empire by Cortez and the conquistadores. And then we saw a large proliferation of religious missionaries who came particularly to places like what's today Texas and California and on up the West Coast, establishing missions. Any town in the United States today that begins with something like San or Santa probably was originally a mission town to reach out to the natives. And we even still have some of those old mission buildings are still extant. Perhaps the most famous is the Alamo, which was an old mission in San Antonio that would later be used as a fort. Now, what were the Indians thinking about the Europeans? Well, we have pretty strong evidence to suggest that the Indians believed that the white people were stupid. They were wearing too many clothes. They didn't understand the way the world works. They didn't understand farming. They didn't understand hunting. And many of them believed that they could exploit the white people. For example, the Powhatans in Virginia believed, and it's probably true, they were allowing the Jamestown people to live among them, not just being subordinated to them, but they were actually superior to that group until 1622, when the Jamestown people tried to move out and take over more lands. That's when the war or a massacre took place in that area. But they certainly saw that they had some technology. The Europeans brought some technology that the Indians thought was really fascinating, very valuable, and so that really led to a desire for a lot of trade. We talked about the fact that the idea of land ownership was somewhat nonsensical to the Native Americans, and that was some way that both the English felt they could exploit the natives and the natives felt they could exploit the Europeans. Perhaps the most notable encounters, the first encounters, we've talked a little bit about the Pilgrims in Squanto and Samoset. In Jamestown, there was somewhat peace between the Powhatans and the Jamestown settlers until the massacre of 1622, where Powhatan felt that the Jamestown settlers were getting a little bit too confident about their abilities. We mentioned the Pequot War, the first war between the Pilgrims and the Indians in New England, 1637. Then we get to the most important war of the 17th century between the English and the natives, called King Phillips War. Basically what happened there was the missionaries in Boston had converted an Indian, and they gave him an English name. It's Johnny. They called him Johnny. His native name was Sassamon. So Johnny Sassamon was converted. He became a Christian, and he went to Harvard at the time. And the head of the Narragansetts, the Indian, King Philip, or Metacom, was not happy about that. He didn't like to see his culture, his religion, being undermined by these new settlers who were trying to convert Indians away from their own culture. So King Philip had some of his men go out and murder Johnny Sassamon for converting to Christianity. In response, the New Englanders felt like we have to do something to protect the converts that we make of the Indians. So they went and retaliated, and you could see where the spiral went from there. Then they had this major war in 1676, spun out of control. 1/3 of the population of New England was killed in King Philip's War, the worst war at the time between the Europeans and the native people. So that's somewhat of a thumbnail sketch of the interactions between the Europeans and the Indians. Far more complicated than that, but try to think of yourself as a native or a colonist at that time, and how would you have interacted with these people that you're trying to live among? This is a very challenging question.